My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 28 years old, and the day my parents divided things fairly, they handed my brother the keys to a penthouse with skyline windows, private parking, and a concierge who knew his coffee order. Then they slid a thin envelope across the table to me like they were doing charity work. Inside was a deed to a cracked commercial parking lot behind an abandoned strip mall on the west side of Phoenix. A piece of asphalt so empty it still had faded arrows pointing nowhere. I stared at it, waiting for someone to explain the joke, and that's when my mother smiled over her wine glass and said, "Well, at least you can sleep under the stars." My father laughed. My brother laughed harder. I didn't, because that lot came with back taxes, weeds pushing through the concrete, and a chain-link fence bent open like even the neighborhood had given up on it. They weren't giving me an opportunity. They were handing me a burden and calling it character building. What they didn't know was that I had spent 6 years working in service bays, learning how customers are judged the second they pull up in a dented car, how working people get overcharged because no one thinks they'll question it, and how a space with enough pavement, water access, and stubbornness could become something worth more than any penthouse view. They thought they were leaving me with nothing. They had no idea that months later, the same people who laughed at me would be standing on that asphalt asking for a cut. Before I tell you what my brother said when he realized what I'd built, and what happened after I refused to hand him even 1 inch of it, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. The next morning, I drove to the lot before sunrise with a folding chair, a thermos of burnt coffee, and the kind of anger that makes you useful. In daylight, the place looked even worse. Cracked pavement, 2 dead light poles, trash wedged against the fence, and the shell of an old retail strip behind it with boarded windows and a roof line full of pigeons. But I also saw the things nobody in my family would ever bother noticing. The lot had street visibility, easy pull-in access, enough room for wash bays, and was close to delivery corridors, ride-share traffic, and 3 neighborhoods full of people who couldn't afford dealership prices. I didn't want another cafe, boutique, or cute weekend market. I wanted a business that fit the ground under it. I wanted something tough, something that worked. So I called Owen Brooks, the one friend I trusted to tell me the truth, even when it hurt. He'd known me since trade school and had watched me get passed over for promotions by men with softer hands and louder voices. When I told him I wanted to turn an empty parking lot into a women-led auto detailing and fleet care yard, a place where rideshare drivers, delivery contractors, nurses, teachers, and small business owners could get honest service without being talked down to, there was a long pause. Then he said, "That is either the smartest angry decision you've ever made, or the second smartest. Either way, I'm in." We spent that first week measuring the lot, sketching traffic flow, calling plumbers, pricing water reclamation mats, and hunting down used shade structures because Phoenix sun doesn't forgive bad planning. I used nearly all my savings on cleanup alone. Then the first setback hit. Zoning. The city wouldn't allow runoff into the storm system, which meant I needed drainage compliance, environmental controls, containment barriers, and a revised site plan. The estimate nearly choked me. A private contractor quoted a number so high I laughed in his face by accident, and he got offended like I was the rude one. The second setback came when a lender looked at my application, looked at me, and asked if there was a male operations partner he could discuss long-term execution with. I walked out before I said something expensive. That night, I sat in my car outside my apartment, gripping the steering wheel, wondering if my parents were right. Not about my worth, but about the world. Maybe they understood it perfectly. Maybe they knew some doors opened automatically for my brother and locked harder when I reached for them. But quitting would have made them profits, and I refused to hand them that victory. So I went smaller, smarter, meaner. I found a used pressure washing rig, negotiated a deferred payment on modular office containers, and started applying for workforce grants aimed at women entering skilled trades. I met Dana Whitmore at the permitting office after my third failed revision. She was brisk, unsentimental, and the only city official who talked to me like I had a future instead of a hobby. She circled 3 items on my site plan and said, "You're not far off. Stop trying to make this look pretty for people who won't save you. Make it legal. Make it durable. Then make it profitable." That sentence changed everything. So I did. I stopped pitching dreams and started building systems. Water containment, interior detailing lanes, shade coverage, fleet turnaround packages, subscription plans, a hiring model that trained women who'd been told all their lives to stay away from tools, grease, and money. Every time I got tired, I remembered my mother lifting her glass and telling me I could sleep under the stars. Fine, I thought. Then I'll build something under them. My brother, Grant Carter, found out what I was doing because my parents couldn't resist gossiping about me like I was a cautionary tale with a pulse. He called while I was hauling broken concrete into a rented dumpster, and the first thing he said was, "I heard you're opening a car wash on your little dirt kingdom." I looked down at my boots, covered in dust, and said, "It's not a car wash." He laughed. "Sure, and my penthouse is a treehouse." That was Grant's gift. He could make contempt sound casual, like cruelty was just another polished accessory. He worked in commercial real estate and moved through life like every room had already agreed to admire him. My parents adored that about him. To them, confidence mattered more than competence, and Grant had been overpraised for so long he thought applause was a birthright. A week later, they invited me to dinner to reconnect, which should have warned me. I showed up tired, sunburned, and still smelling faintly like degreaser, and walked straight into a performance. Grant had 2 friends there from his office, and before the salads even arrived, my father asked me, in that fake soft voice he used when he wanted an audience, "So how's the parking lot project?" Grant leaned back and said, "Dad, don't call it a project. Naomi is revolutionizing asphalt." Everyone laughed except me. Then my mother added, "We do worry about how this looks. You've always been so intense. Not hardworking, not determined, intense, the family word for difficult women who don't stay grateful." I should have left, but something inside me wanted them to hear themselves while I was still sitting there alive. So I asked, "How exactly does my business embarrass you more than giving one child a penthouse and the other a tax bill?" That shut the table up for a second. Then Grant smiled the way people do right before they stab you in a socially acceptable place. "Because I can maintain what I'm given," he said. "You turn everything into a fight." I walked out before dessert, but not before my mother called after me, "You always choose drama." That sentence stayed with me all week because it was the cleanest summary of family favoritism I had ever heard. The favored child gets to create damage and call it personality. The other child reacts to damage and gets called dramatic. Tell me that isn't true in more families than people want to admit. But humiliation is useful if you know what to do with it. The day after that dinner, I pitched my business at a local workforce development panel and nearly blew it. My voice shook. My slides froze. One committee member asked if there was enough demand for premium detailing, and I nearly said this was exactly why working people got ignored, because the second they weren't luxury clients, people assumed they didn't deserve quality. Instead, I took a breath and answered with numbers: rideshare volume, fleet turnover, service deserts, recurring packages, labor demand, and the training gap for women in skilled trades. I left that room convinced I had failed. 3 days later, I got the call. Partial grant approved. Not enough to make things easy, but enough to make them possible. Owen whooped so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Then came Victor Salazar, a retired mechanic with a reputation for honesty so strong half the neighborhood still called him before they bought a used car. He stopped by the lot one afternoon, watched me wrestle a hose line for 2 full minutes and said, "You're doing that wrong." I told him he was welcome to keep walking. He grinned, took the hose, fixed my setup in 10 seconds, and stayed for 4 hours. Victor didn't do pity. He respected work. He became the first person outside Owen who looked at my lot and saw a business instead of a joke. By the end of that month, we had a name: Second Shift Auto Yard, because most of our first customers would be people whose real lives started after everyone else got home. Nurses after 12-hour shifts, delivery drivers at dusk, single moms on Saturdays, teachers during breaks, people who used their cars like lifelines. I hired my first 2 trainees, both women who had been told the auto world wasn't for them, and when they held their first polishers like they belonged there, I felt something crack open inside me. Not revenge, not yet. Something better. Proof. Still, every good thing seemed to wake up new resistance. Materials got delayed. A supplier backed out after reconsidering the market. A portable office unit arrived with a broken lock. And then, the morning we were supposed to seal the wash pad, someone cut the temporary water line and left the valve running just enough to flood one section of the lot. Owen found it first. "Could have been vandalism," he said. "Could have been kids." Maybe, but I had spent my whole life around one particular kind of sabotage, the kind that arrives smiling later and asks how things are going. We opened on a brutal Saturday in late May with 3 shade canopies, 2 detailing lanes, 1 small office container, a hand-painted sign, and more fear than cash. But by 8 a.m., there were already 6 cars lined up at the gate. Victor had quietly called in favors, and the neighborhood showed up the way communities do when they sense somebody is trying to build something that belongs to them instead of extracting from them. A hospice nurse brought her SUV in caked with dust and dog hair and nearly cried when we got it clean enough that the interior smelled new again. A delivery driver signed up for monthly fleet service on the spot. A teacher asked if we offered weekend appointments because she couldn't miss school. By noon, the lot that had once looked abandoned sounded alive. Hoses spraying, vacuums humming, customers laughing beneath the shade, music coming from an old speaker Owen had zip-tied to a post because nothing on that site was elegant yet. But all of it was real. That was the first time I understood success doesn't always arrive with a dramatic soundtrack. Sometimes it sounds like people trusting you with something they use every day. Of course, that was exactly when Grant arrived. He came in a black SUV so polished it looked rented for a scene, and my parents stepped out behind him dressed like they were attending a fundraiser instead of my opening. My mother took one slow look around the lot and said, "Oh." Just that. One syllable loaded with disappointment, surprise, and irritation that I had made the place look legitimate. My father pretended to inspect the fence line like he was evaluating a tenant. Grant smiled at my customers before turning to me and saying, too loudly, "This is cuter than I expected." The woman at the check-in table heard him and rolled her eyes so hard I nearly laughed. "Why are you here?" I asked. My father answered first. "To support you." It was such an obvious lie that even he seemed embarrassed hearing it out loud. Then Grant added, "And to make sure you're not over your head. Liability on a place like this can get ugly fast." There it was, the warning disguised as concern. He walked the perimeter with my father, whispering, pointing, photographing things on his phone, and 15 minutes later, 2 code compliance officers rolled in. Not health inspectors this time, stormwater and site compliance. My stomach dropped so hard I felt it in my knees. The younger version of me would have panicked and handed my brother the exact collapse he came to witness. But Dana Whitmore had prepared me for this kind of moment. I had binders ready, permit copies, drainage maps, water containment logs, vendor receipts, waste disposal contracts. Before the officers could ask their second question, I was already handing them the relevant page. Victor stood near the lane entrance with his arms crossed like a human warning sign. Owen quietly redirected waiting customers and kept the line moving. Grant watched from near the gate, smug at first, then irritated, then increasingly still as the officers stopped finding problems. One of them even said, "Honestly, this is more organized than half the sites we see." My mother's mouth tightened. My father looked annoyed in a different way now. Not because I was failing, but because I wasn't. When the officers left without a citation, several customers clapped, partly because they were relieved, and partly because everyone there had recognized a setup when they saw one. Grant muttered, "Don't get cocky." I stepped toward him and lowered my voice. "You should leave before this gets embarrassing." He smiled like he hadn't heard the threat under the sentence, but I saw it land. Then my mother did something that would have broken me a year earlier. She looked around at the women working my lanes. Women sweating, laughing, learning equipment, taking payments, moving with confidence, and said, "I still don't understand why you insist on doing everything the hard way." I looked at her and realized she truly meant it. In her world, value only counted if it came pre-approved by status, polished by men, and cushioned by inheritance. She couldn't understand why anyone would build from the ground up if they could spend their life trying to be chosen instead. "Because the easy way was never offered to me," I said, "and because some of us got tired of waiting to be respected." My father told me not to make a scene, which would have been funny if it weren't so predictable. Grant left with them, but not before stopping at the gate, turning back, and saying, "You know, this kind of thing only works until real investors notice the land." That line sat wrong in my head for hours. It wasn't mockery, it was interest. And when your golden child brother suddenly stops laughing at your asphalt and starts talking about land value, you learn to hear the difference. The first month after opening should have been the part where I finally breathed. Instead, it was where the real attack started. At first, it looked small. 2 anonymous one-star reviews posted the same afternoon, claiming our staff had stolen sunglasses from a glove compartment and scratched a luxury sedan. Then, a local neighborhood forum lit up with comments saying runoff from our site was probably contaminated. A man I'd never seen before came in demanding a refund for a service he couldn't prove he'd purchased. One customer showed me a blurry clip being shared online of an oily puddle near a curb with a caption naming my business, except the curb in the video wasn't even ours. The lies weren't random. They were coordinated just enough to feel organic, which meant somebody either knew what they were doing or had paid somebody who did. I called a team meeting in the office container that still smelled faintly of paint and summer heat. My staff looked scared, angry, and insulted in that particular way people do when they've worked hard and are being recast as dishonest by strangers. Owen wanted to go after the accounts publicly. Victor wanted to find whoever started it and introduce them to old-school consequences. I wanted proof. Because accusations thrown upward at privileged people bounce off. Proof, timed correctly, can crack the whole mask. So we started documenting everything. Customer intake photos, vehicle condition videos, security timestamps, water testing logs, payment records, every bay, every car, every complaint. Then Dana called me from the city. Her voice was flat in the way professionals get when they already know something is rotten. "We received an anonymous packet alleging unpermitted chemical disposal and unsafe employment practices," she said. "I'm not saying panic. I am saying be ready." Anonymous packet. The wording alone sounded expensive. That night, I barely slept. I sat at my kitchen table scrolling the fake reviews, reading lines clearly written by people who had never set foot on my lot, and a memory came back so hard it felt physical. Being 13. Overhearing my parents tell relatives that Grant was naturally exceptional, while I was resilient. At the time, I thought resilience was praise. It took me years to understand it was the family label for the child expected to survive neglect without making anyone uncomfortable. The next morning, I checked the office camera feeds again and found something interesting. 2 nights earlier, a silver sedan had pulled up outside the side fence. A man got out, photographed the drainage area, then slipped an envelope under our office door. We found the envelope in the footage because one of my trainees had accidentally kicked it aside the next morning. Inside, it was a glossy brochure from Grant's firm about urban redevelopment opportunities, with one sentence circled in pen: underused commercial surfaces can be transformed through strategic acquisition. No signature, no note, just pressure. As if he was reminding me that the family joke parcel had become land he now wanted back under his kind of control. That same week, my mother called. Not to ask how I was holding up, but to tell me I was being combative, and that I should consider bringing Grant in, on the business side, before my small operation got too complicated. There it was. The whole plan, finally visible. Laugh at me while the lot was worthless. Undermine me once it had customers, then re-enter as savior, strategist, owner. I told her no so quietly it seemed to unsettle her more than yelling would have, but I still needed to stop the bleeding because pride doesn't pay payroll. So instead of hiding from the rumors, I went louder. We announced Open Yard Saturday. Free car seat sanitation checks, discounted rideshare packages, live demos on paint correction, and a women in trades workshop where high school girls could try tools, ask questions, and see what skill looked like up close. If someone wanted to paint us as shady, I'd flood the place with visibility. And if you've ever had someone try to rewrite who you are, you know why public truth matters. Not because strangers should define you, but because silence lets liars rent space in your life. By the time the event flyer went live, registrations jumped, the community chamber reposted us, and a regional courier company asked to stop by and evaluate our fleet turnaround process. That was the kind of contract that could stabilize the whole business, which, of course, meant Grant would move next. He did it the morning of Open Yard Saturday. Not in secret, not through a burner account. He showed up in person, wearing a pale suit like he was about to host a panel discussion on my ruin, with my parents beside him, and a man in a navy blazer I recognized from his firm's website, a development investor named Richard Bell. The lot was already filling with customers, students, local press, and community partners when Grant walked straight into the center lane and said, "Naomi, we need to discuss the future of this property like adults." Conversations around us thinned. Cameras turned. He knew exactly what he was doing. Public pressure, social theater. The investor stood back, studying the site with predatory calm, like he was already imagining my business scraped off the map and replaced with rentable glass. I told Grant this wasn't the time. He smiled. "Actually, it's perfect. Dad and I have been reviewing the deed structure, and we think this land would perform better under professional management. We're prepared to offer you a role if you transfer operating control before the city issues enforcement actions." My mother jumped in before I could answer. "This is generous, Naomi. Please don't be emotional." There's something almost supernatural about how quickly some parents can revert to the script that kept one child small for decades. In one sentence, she had dismissed my work, anticipated my resistance, and framed my refusal as instability. The old me might have exploded right there. But I had spent too many months learning systems to collapse into theirs. So I asked, loud enough for the crowd to hear, "What enforcement actions?" Grant shrugged as if the answer were obvious. "The ones coming after the inspection. You knew this wouldn't last." That was the moment Dana Whitmore stepped through the gate with 2 city officers and a clipboard. The timing would have looked scripted if life were kinder. Instead, it was just perfect. The lot went quiet. Dana nodded to me, then to Grant, and said, "Actually, Mr. Carter, since you're here, this may be useful." One of the officers carried a sealed evidence bag. My heart started pounding, not from fear, but from recognition. They had found something. Dana turned to me first. "We reviewed the anonymous complaint file, the runoff allegation, and the footage you submitted. We also subpoenaed nearby camera angles from the adjacent tire shop." Grant's smile didn't vanish all at once. It frayed. "Those videos show a vehicle registered to a holding company linked to your firm entering the site after hours on 3 occasions," she said to him. "One visit involved tampering with water controls, another involved placement of petroleum-stained absorbent pads near the runoff zone. The third involved staged photography later used in a false online complaint." Richard Bell, the investor, took one step away from Grant like contamination traveled fast. My father opened his mouth, closed it, then tried indignation. "This is ridiculous." Dana didn't even look at him. In addition, payment records tied to a marketing contractor show coordinated review activity against this business within hours of those site visits. That part came from Owen, who had done more than calm me down the past month. He had tracked usernames, timestamps, and billing entities, then handed everything to a lawyer friend willing to help, because his wife used our services and was furious on my behalf. Grant tried the obvious move next. "You can't prove I authorized anything." Victor, who had been standing near the demonstration area all along, lifted a tablet and said, "That's why I saved the voicemail." The whole crowd turned. Victor hit play. Grant's voice came through clear as desert light. "I don't need it shut down forever. I just need it unstable long enough for her to take the offer." The silence after that recording was violent. My mother's face went white. My father looked at Grant not with guilt, but with offended disbelief, as if the problem were not what his son had done, but that he had done it sloppily enough to get caught. Richard Bell took off his sunglasses and said coldly, "Our firm won't be involved in anything connected to this." Then he walked out. The local reporter near the gate didn't just write that down, she recorded it. Grant tried one last laugh, but it came out thin and strange. "She set this up." I stepped toward him for the first time all morning. "No," I said. "You just never learned that people who build from scratch keep receipts." Then Dana informed him that a formal referral was being made for property tampering, fraudulent complaint activity, and interference with a permitted commercial site. He wasn't handcuffed on the spot. Real life is often less cinematic than people want. But he was publicly finished. And sometimes that lands harder. My mother actually reached for my arm then, as if family could be pulled back on like a coat when the weather changed. "Naomi, please," she whispered, suddenly soft, suddenly human, suddenly afraid of standing on the wrong side of the story. I stepped back. "You laughed when you handed me this lot," I said, not shouting, which somehow made it cut deeper. "You called me emotional every time I defended myself. You taught him he could take from me as long as he smiled while doing it." Nobody around us moved. Not my staff, not the customers, not the girls holding workshop packets under the shade tent. Everybody heard it. My father told me not to say things I'd regret. I almost smiled. That advice is about 20 years late. Then I turned my back on all 3 of them and walked to the front of the lot, where customers were still waiting, cameras still rolling, and my actual business, still needed to run. "Open the demo lane," I said. "We're not losing today." And we didn't. Not even close. What happened after that was better than revenge in the childish sense, because it lasted longer and cost more. Grant's firm suspended him within 48 hours. The investor backed out of 2 pending deals. The local business paper picked up the story. Then a Phoenix news segment ran a piece on women in trades that used my lot as the centerpiece. and mentioned the sabotage attempt without even needing to say my family's last name twice. Public shame does what private guilt rarely can. It forces consequences on people who thought charm was insurance. The fake reviews were removed. The complaint file collapsed. The courier company signed a 6-month fleet contract with us after watching how we handled pressure. Open Yard Saturday brought in more customers than our first 3 weekends combined, and 2 parents from the workshop asked if I would ever consider creating a paid training track for young women who wanted hands-on skills without drowning in student debt. I said yes before they finished the question. 3 months later, Second Shift Auto Yard expanded into a structured evening apprenticeship program. 6 months after that, we added a second service lane and mobile fleet units. A year later, the lot my parents had mocked as a place to sleep under the stars was lit every evening by work lamps, compressor lights, and the glow of women getting good at things the world once told them not to touch. As for my parents, they didn't apologize right away. People like that usually need reality to invoice them more than once. My father lost credibility in circles where reputation was currency. My mother discovered that social friends who love confidence do not love scandal. Then came the final twist I had not expected but should have. Grant's penthouse had been partially financed through a chain of family guarantees and leveraged assets tied to deals now under stress. The polished symbol of favoritism turned out to be exactly what it had always been: expensive theater. When one project collapsed and another stalled, the carrying costs started to hurt. That was when they came to me, not to repair the past, not to ask what I needed. They came to my office container, which had since been renovated into a real glass front operations room overlooking the lot, and my mother cried before she sat down. My father tried dignity first. Grant tried silence. Then, finally, the truth. They wanted in. A licensing arrangement. A family holding company. Expansion money for all of us. My brother, said maybe the brand could scale faster if we worked together. I looked at the 3 people who had spent years confusing access with love and entitlement with leadership, and I understood something so clearly it felt peaceful. They didn't miss me. They missed my usefulness. That is not the same thing, and too many people ruin their futures by pretending otherwise. So I told them no. No partnership, no equity, no advisory role, no family umbrella. I said the only contribution I would accept from them was a donation, with no naming rights and no control, to a scholarship fund for women entering skilled trades. My father called that vindictive. I called it boundaries with paperwork. Grant finally snapped then, saying I was punishing them. I held his gaze and answered, "No, I'm just refusing to rescue the people who laughed while I was drowning." My mother asked if there was any path back. There was, but not the one she wanted. I told her, accountability is not a speech in private after the damage stops paying off. Accountability is changed behavior that costs you something. Accountability is telling the truth when lying would protect your image. Accountability is admitting, out loud, that favoritism doesn't just wound the child who gets less. It also deforms the child who gets too much and teaches an entire family to confuse imbalance with love. A week later, to my surprise, my parents attended our apprenticeship graduation. They sat in the back. They clapped when the trainees crossed the lot to receive certificates under the lights. My father looked old. My mother looked smaller than I remembered. Grant didn't come. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he wouldn't. At the end of the ceremony, I stood in front of our newest class and looked out across the same asphalt I'd once been expected to treat as a curse. This place, I told them, exists because nobody handed us the easy version. And that hurts, until the day you realize building your own foundation also means nobody gets to pull it out from under you. That, to me, is the real lesson. Success is not best measured by the people you defeat. It's measured by what you build that keeps helping others long after your anger has cooled. My parents gave my brother a penthouse and left me an empty parking lot. They thought one looked like love and the other looked like loss. But the penthouse was a gift that made him dependent on being favored. The lot was a burden that forced me to become capable. In the end, they came back, begging to share what grew there. And I finally understood the one thing neglected children learn too late. Being underestimated can become an advantage the moment you stop asking the people who hurt you to recognize your value. So tell me honestly, if your family laughed while handing you less, would you ever let them back in once you turned it into everything? My personal view is that the villains in this story are especially disturbing because they feel so realistic. Naomi's parents are not just cruel, they normalize favoritism and treat emotional neglect like good parenting. In my opinion, that makes them even more damaging because they don't just hurt one child, they also raise Grant to believe entitlement is normal. Grant, meanwhile, is the kind of villain many people recognize in real life, polished, arrogant, manipulative, and confident that family privilege will protect him from consequences. Have you ever seen someone become selfish or arrogant because their family always excused their behavior? And do you think favoritism can quietly destroy an entire family over